We are gathered here for a conversation entitled Beyond Black and White. What will it mean to be racial ethnic in the PCUSA? The students at the Johnson C. Smith Fellowship were talking about some of the results from our recent General Assembly, some of the things that, the topics about what's going on in our community, in our church, and we came up with this idea because, you know, in our courses, we know from our history books what it meant to be racial ethnic in the Presbyterian Church. We have an idea of what it is now, but given our current climate, what will it mean? And so we have a distinguished, not panel, but table of friends. We have the Reverend Dr. Margaret Aymer, the Reverend Dr. Jin Kim, and the Reverend Dr. Mark Lomax. Their biographies are in your program, so we won't read the program. And this is meant to be a dialogue, and you are a part of this dialogue. And so we thank you for being here, and we'll let the conversation begin.
No question? No.
No, I think he starts us off, and that's it.
Okay.
So the question is, what will it mean to be racial ethnic in a church that has been ascendant but now is on a rapid numeric decline, where the national budget is being slashed, where this presbytery has been very painfully reorganized very recently, as have almost every presbytery in the country, where racial ethnic churches, when it comes to African American churches, are on a steep decline, where the Korean church is on a rise, and the church is splitting over all sorts of issues. And what are the implications of that for those of us who are of color in the church? Now, it's interesting because they've got me in here, and I've got two pastors, one on either side of me. Closing in on the seminary professor, right? Because one of the things I think for me as a seminary professor, and Mark is also a seminary professor, is that we're going to have to rethink what it is we do in the classroom and how it is we prepare ministers of word and sacrament to do ministry in a world that is much bigger and much more complicated and much less sure than we have been led to believe even a generation ago when I was in seminary.
Well, I'd like to start with my autobiography because I think one of the things we discovered in recent times is that there's no such thing as some kind of metaphysical truth. You know, we start with our concrete flesh and blood selves and we extrapolate from there. I think that's a humble admission of how all of us come to whatever we understand as truth. So I'd just like to let you know that I'm an immigrant to this country. I was born in Korea in the midst of the conflict in North and South Korea, which is all solved now. Oh boy. And our family came to this country when I was 7 years old, so I've lived, you know, most of my whole life here. And one of the things to understand about my home country of Korea is that it's, in terms of our relationship to the Christian faith, it's very different than many other countries in Asia. For instance, in Japan, Christianity is a Western colonial religion. You get that? Because the U.S. defeated Japan in World War II. It also was a colonial religion for China. Remember the Opium Wars and everything subsequent to that, the Boxer Rebellion, all that stuff. India and so much of East and South Asia, Christianity is a colonial Western religion. But in Korea, which was colonized by Japan in 1910, and the Shinto religion was forced upon the Korean people, the Western Christian faith was a religion of liberation, right? I'm not talking about liberation theology out of Latin America or out of African American black theology or womanist theology. I'm talking about kind of pretty run-of-the-mill conservative white theology as nothing short of liberating the Korean people from the forced oppression and occupation of Japanese colonialism. And so the white missionaries gave Koreans language of self-determination, of independence, of the belief that there is a God that is bigger and stronger and mightier and higher than the Shinto God. That's liberating. And we are accountable to that God. And so when World War II ended and Korea, well, it was partitioned and South Korea came under the sphere of the United States, but when it had a certain amount of autonomy, it really took that faith, this liberating faith, and ran with it, so that South Korea is probably one of the most Christianized countries in the world today. And if you're talking about serious Christians, you know, definitely not just, you know, membership by baptism or something. And so context is important. You know, Christianity was on the right side of Korean history, unlike in most other parts of the world. So now that gives us a certain perspective when we come to this country. For Korean people, you know, in American mythology, the white man is the sheriff who comes to clean up the town. He is the pioneer who settles new land. He is the cowboy that brings frontier justice. To the Korean people, the white man stands for all those things too, liberating us from Japanese occupation and colonialism, and protecting us from North Korea and the communists and all that stuff. So we come in really so ideally suited to enter into white American mythology. I mean, what do we have in our background to counter that, to oppose that way of shaping imagination? So our primary task then is to enter into white privilege and the white framework and perpetuate the very system that brought us liberation and gave us the right God. It's hard to counter, right? It's hard to counter. I mean, are we going to teach something different than that? And how do we teach something different than that when that's all we've known now for, you know, close to a century? So that's where we are and what we have to contend with, and what does it mean then for the gospel to be liberating good news when we've already received liberation in a certain framework and we're not even aware that we need liberation from that liberation. Right. Challenging. But that's who I am. And through that, became a pastor in the Korean church for 10 years, and then somehow, by God's grace, had the craziness to launch a multicultural church called Church of All Nations, which now includes people from over 25 nations in Scandinavian, German, white Minnesota, of all places. So you know God has a sense of humor to have a Korean lead a multicultural church in Minnesota, where it was 2 degrees this morning. So I'm so glad to be here. That's all right. I'll pass it on to Mark.
Oh, good evening. I'm glad to be here also. Both Jin and Margaret are good friends of mine, and Jin and I have maybe a longer history than Margaret and I believe, but when he was conceptualizing the Church of All Nations, we had opportunity to share in fellowship, conversation, dialogue, visioning together. And of course, I've worked with Margaret for the last 10 years now on the faculty of ITC, a brilliant scholar in her own right, radical, feminist voice, amen, around Scripture. She does, she bends the Scriptures in ways unimaginable. So I'm delighted to be here. You know, since being asked to participate on this panel, have been struggling with why the church is so far behind the rest of the world. You know, the rest of the world in many ways is already way beyond black and white. The rest of the world is colored. Did y'all know that? That the majority of the people in this world are not white. The overwhelming majority are colored, various hues, and that while white folk, generally speaking, in terms of their command of resources, have dominated the world for quite some time now. They don't have the only reality or speak the only truth or have all power ultimately. And I think that much of the world is responding to white power in particular ways because we've been forced to respond to white power. But things are changing now. The sands are shifting. And even in America now, we see the rise of colored folk as the browns come into the majority position, as more and more Asian descended people come to this country, even as African folk refuse to die, keep on having babies like the Israelites did back in the days of Exodus. White folks are shivering and shaking and trying to cling to power. And in some corners of the white world, becoming very vicious and brutal. Just look at what goes on around the Obama administration as one example of that. I think that what we bring as people of color to the Christian church is a renewed vision of what it means to be Christian. I hope that's what we bring. I think we've got to quit responding to white interest. And we have to consider why God has called us at this moment in time. And what it is that God would have us to do, not just in the Presbyterian church or any other church for that matter, but in this world house of ours. What is it that we've been called to? As both pastor and teacher, I'm asking students to think about, what vision has God given you for those whom God has called you to lead? What do you imagine the world to be tomorrow? And in what sense is God inspiring that imagination? And then what are the working tools that God has given you to help you construct that reality? Because after all, I believe that's what the prophets were up to. It's not an idea really original to me. Walter Brueggemann talked about it in his book, Hopeful Imagination. What world will the world be tomorrow? What will we construct? Another scholar, Olin Moy, in his book, The Sacred Art of Preaching, says that church folk believe what the preacher tells them. So my question to the preacher is, what are you saying?
Right. Right.
We can either help people to live into somebody else's vision and reality that ultimately means our oppression and ultimate destruction. Or we can begin dreaming a new reality, a new way or new ways of being in the world together. Ways that perhaps look more like the reigndom of God. And I know all of us hope that the reigndom of God is more of a rainbow than it is black and white, right? That would be so boring. Can you imagine spending eternity in black and white? Has to be more colorful, more fruitful than that. But how do we begin to shape consciousness as preachers and teachers and leaders in ways that pretend toward a more loving, hopeful, gracious world system? Gracious in the sense that